Welcome to class, everyone. I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy and that you're ready to learn. Today we're going to be learning about the first 5 presidents of the United States and how their actions and choices shaped the government and the country. So I provided each of you with a link to our guided notes. So as you can see here, these are our guided notes. We have a section for each president as well as a vocabulary section at the top. Don't worry if you miss a blank once in a while. I'll make sure I get you caught up before the end of the lesson. So before we start, I'm curious if any of you have considered how our presidential office got to its current state. Have you ever thought about why our president has the power that he does? During this lesson, we're going to delve into Presidents Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, as well as see how each of their choices impacted their office and their country. I want to start out by giving you a couple questions to keep in the back of your mind. One of these is, how may the actions and responses of early presidents have contributed to the power of the government in the presidential office? Additionally, how do you think past presidents may have influenced our current government and our lives? So let's move on to our first president, which is George Washington. And before we get started, I want to point out that these bolded words, our key vocabulary words, and the questions on the portraits are questions you should be considering for your guided notes and the web quest you'll be doing after the lesson. So to start with George Washington, he was the first president of the United States, and as such, he established many important precedents, including the establishment of the cabinet system. The cabinet system is a system in which the president appoints advisors, who are experts in their fields to help guide him during his presidential terms. We still have the cabinet system today, and those in the cabinet are very influential to the president. Another precedent that Washington set was stepping down after 2 terms. While there wasn't originally a 2-term limit, Washington chose to step down after serving 2 terms, which would be 8 years, and he prompted others to do the same through his actions. This ensured a peaceful transition of power, meaning that there weren't disputes or uprisings about who should be in power. These 2 precedents were very important ways that Washington shaped and strengthened the presidential office and the federal government. President George Washington also favored limiting political ties with other nations in order to ensure sovereignty. That is to say, by making sure that the United States could function independently from other nations, it could remain free and independent. Okay, so you can see that on this slide we have a few vocabulary words and a few blanks for your guided reading that I want to revisit with you so that we can be sure everyone's caught up. And I'll also switch to this slide, which highlights the answers to the questions and how this president demonstrates them. So George Washington was the first president of the United States. So your first blank is going to be the word first. As such, he established many important precedents, including the establishment of the cabinet system and of stepping down from office after 2 terms. Washington also believed limiting political ties with other nations in order to ensure sovereignty. Okay? Great job, guys. I'm sure you noticed that we also have a few vocab words. So on each slide, I've bolded the words that will appear on your vocab list to make it a little easier. So on this slide, we have the cabinet system, precedent, and sovereignty. The cabinet system, as we just learned, is a system in which the president appoints advisors who are experts in their fields to help and guide him during his presidential term. So you can see these vocab words right here on your guided notes. So once again, the cabinet system is a system in which the president appoints advisors who are experts in their fields to help guide him during his presidential terms. Okay, great job, guys. The next term we're going to talk about is a precedent. A precedent is a choice or event that occurs and serves as an example for similar cases of the future. So a precedent is a choice or event that occurs and serves as an example for similar cases in the future. For example, by stepping down after his 2nd term, Washington set a precedent for others to do the same. That is to say, the presidents following him weren't required to step down after the same amount of time, but every president until the 1930s did so because of the significance of Washington's actions. Lastly, that we're going to discuss, we have the term sovereignty. Sovereignty occurs when a state is independent and self-governing. Okay? Sovereignty occurs when a state is independent and self-governing. Okay, great job, guys. Now we're going to move on to the 2nd president, who is John Adams. So John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States, and the XYZ affair took place during his presidency. This affair was a conflict between the United States and France, which resulted in the United States increasing the size of the Navy, and also led Adams to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. Both of these measures were taken because with growing tensions between the United States and France, Adams and his administration feared an eventual war with France. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which impacted immigration and freedom of speech, were very unpopular with the public. The Alien Acts made it more difficult for immigrants to vote and targeted specifically French and Irish immigrants due to the tension surrounding the XYZ affair. Whereas immigrants previously would have been allowed to vote after 5 years in the United States, these acts increased the voting time to 14 years. Additionally, they limited immigration and made deportation easier. However, the Sedition Acts were the most unpopular of the two. The Sedition Acts basically outlawed speaking against the government, and anyone who spoke or wrote untrue or malicious things about the federal government could be fined or even arrested. These acts were unconstitutional, but they demonstrated the government's strength and ability to create new laws. And they also demonstrated President Adams' attempts to discourage foreign invasion and interference in the United States. And as again, I've highlighted some of the key points on the slide. Okay, everyone. So once again, we have some blanks on our guided notes and vocabulary words about Adams' presidency. We'll go ahead and start out with the guided notes. So John Adams was the second president of the United States, and during his time in office, the XYZ affair occurred. This was a conflict between the United States and France, which resulted in the United States increasing the size of the Navy and led Adams to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, which impacted immigration and freedom of speech. All right, and we have one vocabulary term on this slide. The Alien and Sedition Acts were acts passed in response to the XYZ affair with France that limited immigration and freedom of speech. Okay, so the Alien and Sedition Acts were acts passed in response to the XYZ affair with France that limited immigration and freedom of speech. I'll give you guys just a second to write, and then I'll move on to Thomas Jefferson, our third president. Okay, so John Adams was unpopular largely due to his Alien and Sedition Acts. So after only one term, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States. Jefferson held the belief that the federal government should only have powers explicitly outlined in the Constitution. However, despite this view, there were several times when he used his presidency to complete actions that were not discussed at all in the Constitution. One example of this was his approval of the Louisiana Purchase, and another is Lewis and Clark's expedition. Nowhere in the Constitution does it explicitly state that the presidents are allowed to authorize purchasing land from other countries, yet that's exactly what happened when Jefferson approved the purchase of the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. Similarly, the Constitution doesn't specifically grant the president power to deploy expeditionary groups, but Jefferson used the office to do so anyway. Both of these actions taken by Jefferson demonstrate that the federal government and its power is both strengthening, and it's growing to take on new roles. Also, during Jefferson's presidency, an embargo was passed against Britain in order to discourage the harassment of U.S. trade ships by the warring nations of France and Britain. This demonstrated Jefferson's intent to protect American interests and sovereignty from other countries. All right, guys. So once again, we have some blanks on our guided readings we'll start out with. So if you'll just look at Thomas Jefferson's section on our readings, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States, and he held the belief that the federal government should only have powers explicitly outlined in the Constitution. However, despite this view, there were several times when he used his presidency to complete actions not discussed in the Constitution. One example of this is his approval of the Louisiana Purchase, and another is Lewis and Clark's expedition. Both of these actions demonstrate a strengthening of the federal government. Additionally, when U.S. trade ships were threatened by the French and the British, Jefferson passed an embargo to discourage their behavior. In terms of vocabulary, we have one more on Jefferson's slide, and it is an embargo, as you can see here. An embargo is a trade ban or restriction against one or more countries. Okay? An embargo is a trade ban or a restriction against one or more countries. This means that Jefferson's administration passed an embargo against Britain. They were restricting trade with them. All right, we'll move on to James Madison now, our fourth president. So James Madison was the fourth president of the United States, and during his presidency, the United States went to war with Britain in a conflict known as the War of 1812. This war occurred after Britain repeatedly violated the rights of American ships, leaving Madison and his administration in a position where it was necessary to defend American sovereignty. Remember, that's one of our earlier vocab words? Some of these violations included capturing American sailors and forcing them to work for the British military, attempting to stop American ships from trading or entering France, and beyond this, the British armed Native American tribes to encourage conflict between the U.S. government and the indigenous civilizations. Overall, the British tried to undermine the Republic and challenge the sovereignty of the United States. This war led to an increased sense of self and confidence and increased the public trust of the United States government. The War of 1812 cost many American lives, but Madison's handling of it reinforced the powers of the U.S. federal government, strengthening power and the legitimacy of the United States. All right, guys. Once again, we'll go over the guided notes. James Madison was the fourth president of the United States, and during his presidency, the United States went to war with Britain in a conflict known as the War of 1812. This war occurred after Britain repeatedly violated the rights of American ships, leaving Madison and his administration in a position where it was necessary to defend American sovereignty. This war led to an increased sense of self and confidence, as well as increased public trust of the federal government. We don't have any vocabulary on this slide, so we'll go ahead and move on to the last president we're discussing, James Monroe. So James Monroe was the fifth president of the United States, and during his presidency there was a so-called era of good feelings, in which there were very limited political conflicts in the United States, which demonstrated the peaceful transitions of political power at this time. Also during this time, one of Monroe's most famous accomplishments was his Monroe Doctrine, in which he discouraged foreign intervention in the Western Hemisphere. In this doctrine, Monroe stated a few major points, including that the United States would stay out of the affairs of Europe and other colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and that Europe would not farther colonize the Western Hemisphere, which would be North and South America, and that European powers would refrain from meddling in American affairs. This demonstrates Monroe's attempts to repel any attempt at future foreign invasion. All right, guys, we're on to our last section of guided notes. So join with me now. James Monroe was the fifth president of the United States, and during his presidency there was a so-called era of good feelings. One of Monroe's most famous accomplishments was his Monroe Doctrine, in which he discouraged foreign intervention in the Western Hemisphere. And finally, we have one last vocabulary word, which is the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine in which the United States instructed European nations to refrain from meddling in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. Okay? So once again, the Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine in which the United States instructed European nations to refrain from meddling in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. All right, guys. Now, if you look at your guided reading notes, you'll see we have one section left. So I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes, and I'll have you guys pause, and I want you to jot down as many examples of how this content relates to your life that you can. So pause this video for 3 minutes and write why this content matters to you, okay? Go. All right, guys, so I'm assuming you've paused for your 3 minutes and you've wrote down your examples. So I'm sure you all came up with some good ones. If you had trouble thinking with any, though, here's a few to get you started. So these presidents contributed to the formation of the country that we're all living in right now, and if it wasn't for them, it might not look the same. For example, have any of you guys been to any of these states? Like Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas or Arkansas? Well, they might not be American territories if it wasn't for these presidents. All right, guys, so that's our lesson for today. But really quickly, I want to remind you that we have a web quest for you to do. So now that you've learned about the 5 presidents, I want you to pick one more in depth and research it and make sure to answer these questions, okay? You can look through the documents on your own time, but I'm running out of time on my screencast. So if you have any questions, just let your teacher know. I hope you guys have a great day.